panel here for the first session of today. We're going to start very quickly just to make up time, and we'll have time for questions after the three speakers have each presented. So I'm very pleased to say that the first speaker is Sara Cummings, who's a social entrepreneur, manager, researcher, currently at the Free University in the Netherlands, and she also is managing director of an NGO, which I think we will hear about in a few minutes. So I'd like to start the session with Sara Cummings on the knowledge of development partnerships and the evolution of the agenda knowledge for development. So thank you.
Dear colleagues and friends, it's a great honour for me to be here today, and I would like to thank the UN Joint Inspection Unit and the World Association for Sustainable Development for the opportunity to talk about knowledge partnerships in the private sector. It's particularly a great pleasure for me to be here because a year ago today, at this location saw the formation of the Knowledge for Development Partnership, an INGO, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. As Professor McQuaid kindly explained, I have quite a number of hats. So I'm an academic, but also a consultant. But if you like, all of my work is really motivated by a desire to look at inequalities and disconnects in the system of knowledge for development. At the moment, my research at the Free University at Amsterdam is on the role of the private sector in knowledge brokering in international development. But I'm also the managing director for the Knowledge for Development Partnership. One of our main programs is the Agenda Knowledge for Development, which I'm going to be telling you about also. Okay, the research project is called The Unusual Sector, the Private Sector in Knowledge Brokering in International Development. And we're trying to develop new insights targeted to the domains of practice, policy, research, and the private sector. And it's called The Unusual Suspect because there's really a lot of research done already on the role of development policy practice and research in knowledge brokering, but actually very, very little at looking at the private sector. For example, the Overseas Development Institution in the UK has published hundreds of publications on research-based evidence, but actually very, very little on the private sector. And our project is based on two knowledge hubs, one in the Netherlands at the Free University and one in Uganda. And the Netherlands arm is focused on the 5 Dutch knowledge platforms, and the Ugandan arm will be looking at private sector partnerships in Uganda. And one of the first things we've established actually is that there's quite a different definition from looking from the Dutch perspective at the private sector than looking at the Ugandan sector, which has far more evidence of knowledge entrepreneurs. And we're taking quite a critical perspective on the private sector. And, you know, we recognise that the Joint Inspection Unit report is an excellent, nuanced understanding of the situation, makes very workable recommendations. But I think we all have to remember the private sector is not a magic bullet, and that we shouldn't forget that there are quite a lot of downsides, or there are some negative stories. You look at, for example, Big Pharma, powdered baby milk, and also some issues related to intellectual property, for example, commercial scientific publishing and the seed industry. And there are really, in development discourse, there are two approaches to the private sector, one fairly positive and the other fairly negative. And also, for a good understanding of partnerships, you really need to have a nuanced and detailed understanding of what the private sector is doing and the role they can play, and also, as one of the speakers talked about yesterday, the unique selling points. And the first part of this project, which started last September, has been a systematic review, and we have made some preliminary findings, and these have implications also for the Knowledge for Development Partnership, which I'm going to talk about now. The Knowledge for Development Partnership was formed, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, here last year, and it's an INGO located in Vienna. And we're supporting a knowledge partnership for inclusive pluralist societies, and much of our work is focused on the Agenda Knowledge for Development. And the Agenda Knowledge for Development has been created collaboratively over a 2-year period, and it was launched itself also at the Global Knowledge Partnership Conference in April 2017. Now, the Agenda Knowledge for Development is based on 13 knowledge development goals with 3 to 7 targets each, and in this sense it mirrors to some extent the Sustainable Development Goals, which it is designed to complement. And it also includes 73 individual statements from UN policymakers, academics, knowledge management professionals and students. And if you like, the motivation for the Agenda Knowledge for Development is very much looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, and our analysis is that there is actually not very much reference to knowledge in the Sustainable Development Goals, and when there is reference to knowledge, it's very much taking a scientific technical perspective and less of a pluralistic perspective. So this Agenda Knowledge for Development is designed to complement the SDGs. So the first knowledge development goals, the first 6, there are 13 in total. Goal 1 is the need for pluralistic, diverse and inclusive knowledge societies. And this includes people who are usually excluded, for example, people who are disabled, for example, or who are excluded due to a migration status. We also want people-focused knowledge societies where self-determination of the individual is really seen as very important. And my particular baby, if you like, is the need to strengthen local knowledge ecosystems and recognise fully their role that they play in international development. Goal 4 is related to the importance of knowledge partnerships. Goal 5, knowledge cities and rural-urban linkages, recognising the role that cities can play in their rural hinterland, and improve knowledge strategies in development organisation, because I think UN organisations and other development organisations really ought to recognise their impact on the wider knowledge development ecology. Okay, so the Knowledge for Development Goals 7 to 13, the capture, preservation and democratisation of knowledge, the need for fair and dynamic knowledge markets, the importance of safety, security and sustainability, and also the importance of legal knowledge, that legal knowledge and legal frameworks are the basis of good societies. Also the importance of improved knowledge competencies and knowledge work, and also that institutions of higher education should play an active role. And I think this is one of the areas, for example, that the Sustainable Development Goals, the main document transforming our world, doesn't focus on enough. I think universities are mentioned 2 or 3 times, where, for example, the private sector and business are mentioned more than 25 times. And also Goal 13, which is related to information and communication technologies for all, recognising, as people mentioned yesterday, that access to the internet is very important in a knowledge society so that everybody can contribute. We're actually working on a new edition of the Agenda Knowledge for Development, which is due to be published in May 2018, and it should be ready for the Nairobi Knowledge Week, which we're involved in. The original version of the Agenda Knowledge for Development included 73 statements, but actually we now have more than 120 statements. And in fact, on Monday, I received the most recent statement from Robert Chambers. I don't know if you know him, but he's, I think, very esteemed professor at the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex. My invitation to all of you is, would you be interested to contribute a statement to the forthcoming edition? In it, you should include your vision of knowledge society or knowledge management for development. So really anything you're interested in related to knowledge. This could be the private sector, but also, for example, I think we don't have at this moment enough references to literature and the arts. It would be less than 500 words with a portrait photo, and the deadline would be 30th of April. And here you can see two of the statements, examples from two of the statements. Petru Dimitrio's statement, but also I've also included here as an example Suzanne Kinawuka's statement, and she's my research colleague at the Unusual Suspects, who's in charge of the Knowledge Hub in Uganda. So if you would like to contribute a statement, please contact me by email. The Knowledge for Development Partnership isn't doing this on our own. We have many partners and members, and we have quite a number of staunch supporters in this room. And we're working with IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and other UN organizations. And IFAD is very kindly publishing the new version of the agenda. And we're also contributing to the new UN-KM network, which is a new fledgling network reminding, if you like, the UN organizations of Knowledge Development Goals 6 about the role of knowledge development organizations, if you like, in the broader knowledge ecology. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Just for those of you who like to Twitter, can I just remind you of the Twitter hashtag, which is hashtag WASD16. So hashtag WASD16. Continuing our theme of knowledge partnerships, key issue of any form of partnership is, of course, implementation. So I'm pleased now to introduce Professor Raymond Sana, who's the titular professor at Basel University, but also teaches at Lüneburg University. He's been a member of various expert groups to do with the global sustainable development, and has also been a drafter of a chapter in the Global Sustainable Development Report in 2015. So I think an excellent follow-up speaker. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe that's it. So, bonjour. Good morning to everybody. First of all, before starting, I'd like to express my congratulations and thanks to the two organizers who made this conference possible. We have, of course, in Geneva, a lot of meetings on sustainability, but I think we also need sustainability to the discussions of sustainability. And what you have now put together is a very good conference to look at the partnerships. Well, my focus will not look at, I'm not going to focus on the grand bargain, the big partnerships between, let's say, World Bank and some development organizations, aid organizations. I'm looking at the nitty-gritty for PPPs, for physical and social infrastructure. So that's the focus of my presentation. I'm not saying that the other ones are not important. On the contrary, the grand bargains of partnerships between countries and international organizations are very important. But let me focus just on the nitty-gritty of PPPs. So I already said I'd be focusing on the PPPs as such, physical and social infrastructure. Now, as you all know, the agreement at the end, just before signing the document in 2015, there were some contentious issues. One was whether there should be only a focus at the national government level, or whether it would be okay also to add subnational levels, because when it comes to a large country, and if you only focus in terms of the reviews at national level, the averaging out doesn't give enough information as to, what really is happening in the country and its different provinces. We need this aggregate information. So I was very happy to see that agreement was reached to also now look at subnational level that could be cities, municipalities, or provinces. And in a way, that's also what I'm focusing on. At the bottom of this page, just to remind ourselves, right, we have governments for purpose. The purpose of governments in most of our countries is we expect of them to organize and provide basic education, social services, urban planning, local infrastructure, water supply, public transport, waste management, housing, local economic development, sewage systems that function, and public order. That's still the domain of governments. We can, of course, include private sector companies to deliver some of these services, but it's the responsibility of our governments to manage this and to do it either by themselves or with and including private sector companies. So financing, in terms of the local government, what's key in terms of the SDGs is 16.6 and 16.7. As a reminder, 16.6 says to develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels. As you know, there are 3 dimensions to the SDGs. Our country is supposed to, at the same time, to focus on sustainable economic, social, and environmental sustainability, all in one, not just environment. And at the same time, to have the 3 principles to put that in action. That is, it should be done in a transparent manner, through participation and inclusiveness. So to be more concrete, when it comes to 16.6, it merely means that we expect our governments to be oriented towards including society, towards participation, hearing from our civil society what they need and what they think should be done, and to do it in a transparent manner. 16.7 is already what I said. It's easier, of course, to talk about that and to organize it. But one of the things I've done books on this, I think one important item, which we haven't discussed sufficiently, is how to help our governments to be effective. Right? There's something about the mechanisms that exist to get the ministries to talk to each other, to cooperate. There are mechanisms to get the government to talk to private sector and to civil society. It's called, to consult, to have a consultative process. So there are things that can be done. I think we should also maybe have another conference on that because it's of crucial importance. How to finance the SDGs. We've heard that already yesterday. We all know these are phenomenal amount of money that is being put forward to us, 2.5 trillion, how to finance this. Of course, it's understandable that we are now hoping somehow it could be financed through other means than the traditional means. But I'd like to remind ourselves, there are these options. Governments can do things by themselves if they have the money and the know-how, and they can go about delivering these services I mentioned just before in the previous slide. If that's not the case, there are other options to include through PPP the private sector, for instance, but it's not just private sector, I'm going to come back to that shortly, or to have other forms of, including privatization, to get services to the people through different means. Now, this also then means when you look at the option and the risks to the government or the risks to the private sector, if it's a private sector government PPP, at the end, as you see, the options, the risks either increase or decrease. But in any case, what is of paramount importance is that if we look at how our governments opt for implementing the SDGs, no matter what solution they might choose, PPPs or non-PPPs or concessions or privatization, we should be sure we keep accountability present with us, not just to hold a government accountable, but to also conduct a continuous dialogue in case of need of changing of course. It is of importance that we have that transparency of what's happening, whether it's effective or not effective. And the same holds for the private sector. We should know if there's a big physical infrastructure project, lots of money being spent, what exactly does that mean in terms of potential indebtedness of the government? How do we know whether it's effective or not effective? These are crucial questions that we should keep asking ourselves. Now, 17.17, partnerships. I highlighted in red, but most people, I think, haven't really looked at it in more detail. It's no longer business as usual, that is, some intermediaries, banking, financial companies that finance on behalf of a government bigger physical infrastructure projects. It's not only that, it continues to be that, of course. It needs to be including still intermediaries, but it's also possible to have PPPs including civil society. It could be with cooperatives. It could be with all forms of community-based organizations. And we have made, actually I participated in another organization based in Geneva called the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. We've done several conferences looking at case examples where very good projects have been put in place and they work, that includes not only private sector and government, but also civil society or cooperatives. That exists. What is problematic, and Barbara Adams mentioned it yesterday, I've done papers on this, we have 17.1, which is the indicator for PPPs. It's just simply inadequate. It only measures money spent, and I don't even know how they're going to go and account for that. But there's nothing about the effectiveness, what kind of PPPs. Next year, we have the opportunity to rediscuss indicators. I hope that we'll do more about 17.1. Last year, I was a speaker in Jamaica for the Caribbean countries about financing the SDGs. So I put this slide in front of the ministers of the region, asking, do you know what this means? The silence was very telling. Now, these are the kinds of PPPs that are in place. If our governments don't know what the legal implications are of each one of them, it's the recipe for disaster. And if on top of it, we have over the next 13 years, probably many of our countries, the governments will change. So the people that are in place who have learned how to manage PPPs and maybe got to know the legal implications of these different kinds of PPPs might no longer be in government. So the next group that comes in might not yet know what this means and what the previous government has signed up to. We need to have much more information shared between us, between the governments, what the options also are. Some of these are more beneficial maybe for the country. Others are more of a hazard in terms of indebtedness. We need to share more information about this. So, you know, if you have a country, as an example, which has gone through structural adjustment programs and has learned or has been told to cut back revenue generation through traditional means, such as tax collection, if there is no money around, of course, the SDGs cannot be financed. So then the country has to look for external financing. And if then the country does that and they don't even know what kind of PPPs are available, then it really could be a recipe for disaster. I have published on this, I'm happy to share that, for future PPPs, we should apply what's in the text of 2015. You know, are these PPPs going to do something about the planet, about peace, about prosperity, in what way, to what extent? It's not just going to be signing off a project and spend the money. We should see what does it generate in terms of SDGs. So at the end, it's a question also of good governance. There are also ISO-related instruments to help improve quality of governance, and I think we'll need all of that in order to ensure that what we do about the SDGs will hold and will be sustainable and will be happy about what we have agreed to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for a very succinct and on-time presentation. This gives us plenty to think about, and I think these are some of the fundamental issues which we do need to discuss over coffee and during the meeting as a whole. Now, the final speaker here, I'm very pleased to introduce, is Simona Hsiao, who is leads the policy coherence team at the UN Systems Staff College and the Centre for Sustainable Development. She's did a PhD originally in international migration, but has extensive experience on partnership building and networking in an intergovernmental setting. So I think this will be another interesting talk, so I'll pass it over to Simona.
All right, thank you very much. And I hope what I'm going to say is going to hopefully build nicely on what we just heard from Sara and Raymond. Again, this is a session on knowledge partnerships, so the question is, how do we ensure that the knowledge that needs to be out there gets out there and is accessible? So I'm going to just tell you a few words about who we are as the Knowledge Center for Sustainable Development. You actually see our beautiful campus on the slide. We always like to show off with that because, you know, who can say that they work in a castle. And this is also our training center. It's the UN campus in Bonn. We belong to the United Nations System Staff College, which is actually headquartered in Turin, in Italy. And we've been created specifically to respond to the mandate of, where are we going? Interesting. All right. To the mandate of the Sustainable Development Goals to ensure that learning, training and knowledge management is fostered within the UN system to address the agenda. Now, even though we are very short of time, I am going to ask you to quickly turn to your neighbor, because one of the things we do is train people, talk about learning, so it's always about, not only about what the people on the panel have to say, but what the people in the room have to say, because there's always a lot of knowledge there. So I'd just like to ask you to talk to your neighbor, whomever your neighbor is, find a neighbor. If you don't have one, quickly find one. You have 1 minute. If you were to train private sector actors about ways to address the 2030 agenda, what is the one thing they should learn? 1 minute. Turn to your neighbor. You're training businesses, private sector actors about the 2030 agenda. What's the one thing at the end of your training they need to know?
Little knowledge is a dangerous thing. That was if you think you know. Yes, one thing is learning to take the perspective of others. That's about joint working and about taking other perspectives. You sound a bit like Rumsfeld, knowing, unknown, whatever it was.
The Persian saying.
It actually makes
All right, and now one more question. Where do you see the biggest capacity gap in the UN in terms of engaging with the private sector? So you're now training the UN. What is it? Where do you see the biggest capacity gap? Turn to your neighbor. All right, thank you. So these are the kinds of questions that we are trying to address as the Knowledge Center, and we don't necessarily have all the answers ourselves. In fact, we draw on the UN system and on partners from civil society, private sector, academia, to find the answers, because as a knowledge center, we are an interagency outfit, and we therefore bring together participants and expertise from within the system, within the UN system and beyond. Now, as I said, we've been established, we're very young still, mandated to respond to the learning, training and knowledge management needs of UN staff, but also other partners, because when we were established first 15 years ago as the UN System Staff College, it was specifically to train UN staff. But with the 2030 agenda, the now Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed asked us in the lead up to the adoption of the agenda, you know, what are you going to do about the agenda? How are you going to train UN staff? And one thing that we noticed very quickly is if you want to train people about a multi-stakeholder agenda, you cannot train them just navel-gazing, talking to themselves. So we've set up the Knowledge Center for Sustainable Development to address that, and most of our learning events, courses, offerings are open to all stakeholders. Today we run a number of courses, one, for instance, on unleashing the power of the private sector in implementing the 2030 agenda, an online course, but also foundational courses on diverse aspects of the agenda, addressing issues such as policy coherence, but also the question of leadership for UN leaders at the country level. If you lead an agency as part of a UN country team, you're supposed to advise the government on ways to address the agenda. What kind of advice are you going to give? How are you going to broker consensus? How are you going to engage stakeholders, etc., etc.? All of it in the context of a one UN effort and in the context of the various UN reforms that aim at repositioning, in particular, the UN development system to address the agenda. What we're trying to do is provide neutral spaces where people not only receive knowledge, but also have a moment to pause and reflect. The good thing when you talk about learning, training and knowledge management is that you get people out of the conference setting. You know, now in a conference setting, we all want to show how what we do is great and how everything we present are successes. The moment you sit in a workshop, in a learning setting, you can also talk about what is difficult, where are you struggling, what are the obstacles, where do you need responses, where are you not confident in the way you're addressing things, and what can you learn from your peers as well. So this is what we're trying to do. The way we are trying to do it is through the approaches to knowledge management, where we look at what is there to know, you know, where is the best of the knowledge that we can find on the different topics that we are talking about. So what, you know, why is that important? What do we do with that? Knowledge sharing, how is this for you? How does it play out for me? What have we learned from that? And then now what? Now, if that's what it is, what are we going to do? How are we applying that? Are there any networks, joint ventures, ideas, next steps, commitments that can stem from that? So that's essentially the way we go about knowledge management, and in fact our role in that sense has been highlighted by the JIU report last year already, that which we are very grateful about, and there is a recommendation in this year's report as well, calling on us together with the ITC to think about a platform to make knowledge accessible for SMEs. Now, before saying a few more words about that, let me just share with you how we approach our learning and training in principle, and this is where I think it builds very nicely on what Raymond just said, in terms of the criteria that we need to apply when we try to identify whether an approach is sustainable or not. In fact, if you open the SDG document, the Transforming Our World that Sara just quoted as well, it starts with 5 fundamental dimensions. It doesn't jump into the SDGs directly, and oftentimes people tend to immediately, when they talk about the 2030 agenda, think, okay, 17 goals, targets, indicators, what are we supposed to do? What is the technical approach to getting this done? But the crucial part of the text is in the first 2 pages, essentially. It's the 5 dimensions, spelling out that unless you address these 5 dimensions in a holistic way, in an integrated way, the outcome will not be a sustainable one. And it walks through the 5 dimensions, being people, prosperity, peace, partnership, and planet. So essentially, this is our new lens to do due diligence. You know, if we are trying to address a development challenge, if we're trying to identify a development solutions, we need to consider what is its effect from a social perspective, from an economic and an environmental perspective. Now, up to there, it's our classical 3 dimensions of sustainable development. It's the 3 top parts of the circle. But then the agenda has added 2 more. It has added the notion of peace, talking about fostering peaceful, just and inclusive society, because there cannot be development without peace. There cannot be any approach to sustainability if there are tensions, if institutions are not accountable, and not functioning. And then the notion of partnerships. And as Raymond just outlined, partnerships not just in the sense of resource mobilization, but partnerships in the sense of identifying where the knowledge and the capacities sit that are required to implement the agenda. So whenever we identify a challenge and think about solutions, we need to ask ourselves, who has the knowledge, local knowledge, institutional knowledge, that we need to, first of all, analyze the situation correctly, and who has capacities, means, again, knowledge, resources, capacities, technology, whatever it is that is required, that we need to bring on board to identify a common approach to address the challenge. So we have been trying to address the different challenges that we are facing, where the way that we construct our courses through this 5P approach, and we're using the allegory of the Rubik's Cube. So I have a little one here, and essentially saying, you know, if you're trying to solve the Rubik's Cube, essentially, most of us can do one side. So you focus on that one side, you do what it takes to pull everything up so that one side gets done, and then you're all happy. The problem is the rest of the Rubik's Cube is completely mixed. And unless you focus, you know, you take into account all the sides, you're not going to get the entire Rubik's Cube done. So that's essentially what we're saying. It's about optimizing coherence. Now, sometimes you even need to undo something that you've already, you know, you thought you had your one side and you really want to hold on to it because you really don't want to undo it. It doesn't feel right, but you have to if you want to get the entire cube fixed. So it's about thinking through synergies, trade-offs, and spin-offs explicitly, and then making choices. Now, as I'm running out of time, just very quickly want to share a few things that we've learned in these initial 2 years, but also in the past through our work at the Staff College with different stakeholders, mainly with the UN, but also with the private sector in terms of where things stand. Now, one point is that whenever we talk about sustainable development, there are lots of different perceptions of what is actually meant. In some countries, immediately you have people thinking about green, environmental, and thinking, okay, so the agenda asks us, tells us the new entry point is always the environmental lens. No, that's not what it says. And Raymond said that before as well. It tells us to identify, to assess the situation through the lens of the 5P, which may mean that we're going to focus on a social issue or on an economic issue, bearing in mind how it connects to the other dimensions, and address that. So it doesn't tell us what is the immediate first issue we need to address. It tells us that we need to be mindful of all the dimensions. And again, there are lots of cultural notions of what sustainable development means. It depends if people come from the Rio environmental constituencies or if they're part of the social development bunch. There will be all kinds of contexts and connotations, and it's often a good thing to start by even unpacking that. You know, what do you understand? How do you say it in your language? What sits behind? Then the issue of the partnerships definition, and I'm going to come to an end. A lot of times partnerships, when you ask people in the UN what is a partnership, they're going to think about, yeah, somebody giving me money to do my job better. And again, it's not necessarily about giving money. We've heard that many times yesterday. It's not necessarily, partnerships do not have to involve money flows necessarily. It doesn't have to be with the private sector only. It could be with civil society. It's about who brings the right capacity. And more importantly, it's about defining a common purpose and then sharing risks and responsibilities to work towards that common purpose. It's not about, I know what I want to do, will you give me money to get it done? It could also be about how, from a UN perspective, can we help other actors in society to work in such a way that overall the societal results goes towards sustainability. So how do we render that more visible? How do we provide spaces for that? Third thing we learned is that there are a lot of, is exactly that, misunderstandings about the purpose of collaboration and misperceptions. We've heard that a lot yesterday. Who are the bad ones? Who are the good ones? What do we need to consider, etc.? And we know that it's a bit more complex than that. We have to look at every partner, sit down and say, what is the common purpose we're working towards? There is a lack of system-wide oversight. Barbara elaborated on that a lot yesterday, on the capacities lacking within the UN system regarding risk assessment, due diligence mechanisms. There is a focus on big players rather than the smaller ones. Many times in the UN, we focus on the very big ones first, misunderstanding or not paying enough attention to the massive potential that the small entities, SMEs, provide. There is a desire to act, but a lack of knowledge how to, where to. And as we said before, a lot of capacity gaps on all sides. Now, finally, again, just to reiterate, it's not a technical agenda. It is really a conceptual agenda. It's about a shift in mindsets. So if nothing else, if this 5P approach is something you walk away with as a lens through which you assess partnerships going forward, that would be a great success from our perspective, and looking forward to the discussion.
All right. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all the speakers. So, Sarah's asked you a hard question, or Simona's asked you a hard question, so now your chance to ask her some hard questions. So, would anybody, and the whole panel, so have anybody got any questions that you would like to ask? Oh, right, at the very far back.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the presentations on the panel. And thank you for convening this timely meeting. I'm here from the State of Palestine mission here in the UN. I have a comment for Madam from UNSSC. I think we talked about the 5P, people, planet, partnership, peace, and prosperity. I think from my side, our side, as a Palestinian and a diplomat here in Geneva, we forget a very essential point, which is political P, number 6P, political will. I think without political will, we cannot achieve the SDGs without a real pragmatic political will. I thank you, Madam. I thank you, sir. Thanks.
Antonio Hautle again from the Global Compact Network Switzerland. It's inspiring what I heard, and I'm just wondering how we could bring that forward. What you said, Professor Sahner, and also you, Simona, I see there would be possibilities to link that to the private sector from my perspective. The question is, how can we do that? And I'm really looking forward. Maybe I come back to you to see what we can do locally here, but maybe also through the Global Compact Network, which is working globally, to really bring that forward. And I didn't realize what you're doing in trainings for the UN, so there would be probably also be resources we could use. And then Professor Sahner on the scientific place, for me is also the question, how can we already do a lot of things and there are lots of things going on, but where could be even more synergies on that level?
Abdelkader Jeflat from Algeria. I very much liked your presentations, and I'm also convinced that knowledge and knowledge for development are the key issues for the SDGs. Maybe only some technical points. One for Sara Cummings. You mentioned at one stage there was no mention of knowledge for development in the SDGs. But when you look at it carefully, you see that components of knowledge for development are there. If you take, for instance, Goal 4, which is quality for education, that is one important aspect of knowledge. The second one is also on the 7 on the 9th, which is innovation, and which is, of course, industrialization and infrastructure. That is also part of knowledge. So although you don't find it concentrated on one stage, it is scattered through various goals. That's only. And I am interested in writing to you to be a member of the community. Thank you. The second point is about knowledge for management of knowledge, or knowledge management. We see there is a big community which is rising, getting very strong on knowledge management, but it tends to be at firm level. And that is, the concept is now more or less appropriated by that kind of community. So it seems to me at one stage, are you talking also at the firm level or at macro level, and whether it should be some clarifications to make it different from what we see in the academic world? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your questions. I'll pass it over to the panel. We can maybe start with the political one, because a fundamental part of all partnerships, of course, is trust. And trust has to be built with people who you didn't previously trust as well. So how do we build up, what's the role of politics in partnerships? But maybe ask all three commentators to answer all three questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, very, very good question. But of course, the political dimension is not really an additional dimension. It's a cross-cutting dimension that is essentially present in all dialogues at all times. In fact, when we do courses on multi-stakeholder engagement, consensus building, there is always a part on the political economy of sustainable development, you know, is how do you identify who is out there? Who are your allies? Who are your detractors? Who needs to be on your side? How can you go about it strategically? That is part of life, but a dimension that needs to be explicitly addressed and thought through, because it is true, we do not live in an ideal world. So I wouldn't see it as the sixth dimension, but I would see it as a relevant dimension that in any interaction we need to be aware of, and we need to be able to think through in a very explicit way, essentially. So I would agree, but I wouldn't make it a sixth dimension. Now, the comment from the Global Compact Switzerland, absolutely, we would be very interested in discussing next steps and collaboration. And the idea, as I said, is to draw on the expertise where it sits. Not, you know, we see ourselves as a convening space, as a neutral go-to place. So this is a conversation I think we can certainly take forward bilaterally. The question on knowledge management and how we see it, we do play a role in the knowledge management networks within the UN system. So on the one level, but we are not we're not looking at knowledge management from a technological perspective, if you will. There are a lot of entities that look into, you know, what kind of systems, etc. I think there are others that are better at that than we are, but we see ourselves as a knowledge management mechanism within the UN system. The very fact that we bring together knowledge from the different UN entities, but also from other stakeholders, and that we try to bring it in a form that is then accessible and available and digestible to different stakeholders. It's in that sense that we see our role in knowledge management within the system.
Antonio, I think you're already doing a very good job in Switzerland. So, I mean, yeah, well, not enough. I think, you know, it will be interesting, from my point of view, to remind ourselves that 17.17, as I said, is not just private sector government. And we have in Switzerland cooperatives who produce, I think, 13% of our GDP, which is quite good. To get away from the old-style business as usual and to broaden it, I think could be useful. It leads me to answer your question about the scientific side. I think the scientific side is next year, comes up, because the first 4 years will be next year of reviewing. All our governments have agreed to review what we've been able to do in terms of implementing of the SDGs. We have not agreed about the methodology. And most of the countries I've worked in don't have a methodology. So it's high time to talk to our different stakeholders, how we're going to measure whether we're ahead or behind, whether we're on target or not. That's a job where science could be quite useful, including the monitoring. Monitoring is not just every 4 years. That's, I would suggest, it would be great if we could make some progress on that. And not only in Switzerland, but in other countries as well. About the question put to us for our dear colleagues from l'Algérie. You know, a lot of the SDGs is about talking to each other. It's multi-stakeholder negotiations, continuous negotiations. I've done a lot in negotiations. I have books in negotiations, and the Arab version so far has not come out because there are some words which are more difficult within Arabic language. One is concessions. Negotiations is based on give and take, inclusiveness about SDG language, making participation possible so the different stakeholders could participate in the negotiation. But if concession is seen as having lost, of having surrendered, it's going to be continuous fight for winning versus losing, or not to lose. So I think a long way to come back. I think our governments need to learn. There's need for governmental learning. Companies need to learn. And civil society and multi-stakeholder engagement also, we need to learn how to constructively talk to each other. And I'm talking out of my own experience in Alger for the World Tourism Organization. You have beautiful assets for tourism development, which could be part of the SDGs, but have to include the stakeholders. So I'd like to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good advert for tourism.
Okay, thank you for these questions. I would first like to respond to the question on politics, and I think this is an important issue. From my perspective, improved approaches to knowledge for development are very political, but they're a little bit under the radar. So if you're harnessing the transformational role of knowledge, for example, changing the status of local knowledge, this is really under the radar, and this is in the way we're trying to approach politics. To the gentleman from Algeria, thank you for your very positive comments, and we would welcome your involvement in the Knowledge for Development Partnership, and thank you for your interest. And I think what you're raising is a very important point, and it really gives me an opportunity to talk about a paper I wrote a couple of years ago, which is I did a critical discourse analysis looking at the text of the Transforming Our World, the Agenda 2030 text, because actually the discourses in knowledge are quite hidden. And if you actually look very closely to them, which is what I did, and really in detail, so not at the words, but how they appeared in relationship to other words, for example, you really see that there's an emphasis in the SDGs on the scientific and technical approaches to knowledge, whereas the pluralistic approaches are actually less evident. And if you looked at in the negotiations leading up, you saw, for example, the indigenous peoples movement or some of the agricultural UN organizations were talking about local knowledge, for example, and these actually disappeared in the final document. So although knowledge is mentioned, I think we really need to look at what sort of knowledge. And I think everybody would agree, you know, a pluralistic, inclusive approach to knowledge is important, and that's what we're trying to do with the Agenda Knowledge for Development to complement the SDGs.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed to all my speakers, and it's been a very, very stimulating and interesting session. I think arguing PPPs are well beyond being measured by turnover or the number of PPPs, and we really have to look at who's involved, what are their real impacts, and how do we measure the various impacts on different members of society and different components of the sustainability agenda. So thank you very much again, and apologies for being a little bit late, but with a few technical problems at the beginning.
So please remember, if we all help and do a little bit, it will make a big difference.